Genesis 9, Noahic covenant, and immediately I've got some problems because I've got to talk to you about covenant. First of all, what is a covenant? What are we talking about when we talk about a covenant? There's an older definition that covenant is establishing a relationship where no relationship exists before. There's a problem with that definition because in almost no case, certainly not in the theological covenants of the Old Testament, in almost no case does God make a covenant with anyone that he has no relationship before he makes the covenant. Certainly here in Genesis 9, Noah walked with God, yes? And had walked with God for some while before he makes the covenant. So I find it better to define covenant along with William Dumbrell, whom I mentioned to you yesterday, way back at the early part of the semester. Do you remember talking about that? Way back, early in the semester, William J. Dumbrell wrote another book called Covenant and Blessing. And in that book, he defines covenant as giving an external form to an already existing relationship. If you look at Genesis 9:1, you begin to see something of that already existing relationship. Then God blessed Noah and his sons and said, "Be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth." Observe, by the way, that he does not say subdue it. Are you with me here? Since we're essentially quoting Genesis 1:28, it is a matter of some interest to me that he omits subdue the earth for Noah. It leads me to speculate that probably fallen man is not able to subdue the earth. That when we, as fallen people, try to subdue the earth, we rape it rather than subduing it. Here is an area where I would disagree with Reformed theology at a fairly significant level. We don't have a creation mandate, not as fallen humanity. We must be not only redeemed, but glorified before we may genuinely subdue the earth. So that issue is a fairly significant one. But the relationship with Noah is based where? As far as Genesis 9 is concerned, 9:1, where is the relationship with Noah based? Okay, I don't have time for discussion, so I got to quit doing that. I'm sorry. I apologize. I abhor myself. It's based in creation. He has already a relationship with Noah in creation. Thus, he is reiterating the creation blessing. And the intent to bless the human race, yes? If the human race is under the blessing of God, two things will happen. They will multiply and they will fill the earth. Yes? Mm-hmm. And now God will make a covenant to affirm and confirm the possibility of multiplying and filling the earth. The covenant, namely, the Noahic covenant, which will guarantee the multiplication and the filling of the earth. The guarantee comes in the promise, the term of the covenant, that God won't destroy the human race by a flood again. Charlie Brown was standing at the window. Charlie Brown or Linus? It was Charlie Brown standing at the window looking at it raining cats and dogs outside, and he was worried and thought maybe there might be a flood that would destroy the human race. And Linus quoted this passage to him, specifically, oy vey. There, 8:22. While earth continues to exist, planting time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night will not cease. Right? So Linus quotes this verse to him. And Charlie Brown says, "Oh, that comforts me greatly." Linus' response is, "Good theology has a way of doing that." So here we start off with the terms of the covenant, God's promise not to destroy the human race with a flood again. There's a limitation on that promise, though. What is it? Say again?
While the earth remains.
Yes. He won't destroy the earth with a flood, but he might destroy the earth with fire. Yes? So it's not an absolute promise that there will be no destruction of the earth, but there is a promise that the human race will continue to exist and have at least the potential of experiencing and enjoying the blessing of God. The other terms of the covenant, we need to get this going here. The other terms of the covenant now lie upon the human race, specifically the terms in chapter 9 of being able to eat the animals. I kind of go back and forth on this. Is this a good thing or a bad thing to be able to eat the animals? When I smell that steak cooking, I'm thinking maybe it's a good thing. On the other hand, eating steak is not always the best thing for you. Yes? Yes? Pork is the other white meat. Yes? And we are certainly, there's nothing in the Noahic covenant that prohibits the use of pork. I'll try to make the case in Leviticus 11 that pork is not prohibited because it's an unhealthy meat. Beef is permitted, yes? Mm-hmm. Is it peculiarly, inherently more healthy than pork? No. So simply the provision of meat may not be an inherent blessing. It may in fact be an example of some things that we've seen before that in God's dealings with sinful mankind, his acts are both wrath and mercy. Romans chapter 1, verses 24, 26, and 28. One of the facts that we learn from that, it seems to me, the present wrath of God functions by turning sinful people over to more sin. Do you remember that in Romans? For this reason, God handed them over. Remember this? One of the functions of God's present wrath is to turn sinful people over to more sin, and it may be possible to view the gift of meat as a further judgment on the human race, but also an act of mercy, increasing the food supply and therefore enabling the human race to multiply. So it may be a little bit of both. There is also the restriction of blood. I'm impressed with that because I find at least 3 times in the book of Genesis that God, in dealing with man, or rather, in man dealing with authority, always has at least some area of restriction to his actions when he is placed in authority. Here, man is given the authority to eat meat, but may not eat the blood. Yes? So in the garden, man was given the authority to eat all fruit except the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil as a means of submission to the sovereign rule of God. Same here. And I find it again in the story of Joseph. Joseph is over everything in Potiphar's house, and nothing is withheld from me except you, he says to Potiphar's wife. Mm-hmm. So at least 3 times. Then one aspect of being in authority is always submission to authority. And in being in authority and submitting to authority, there is some aspect of my rights that is curtailed. Does that make sense to you? So here, Genesis 9, the restriction of blood and the requirement for capital punishment. The human race is not only empowered but required to carry out capital punishment against anyone who sheds blood. That includes animals as well as humans. Our American discussion over capital punishment is colored by the fact that we have been unjust in the way we have executed criminals. God gives no extenuating circumstances. So if a guy is really a nice guy, but through negligence causes the death of another person, God doesn't permit a life penalty or 10 years penalty for this. Do you follow this? It is to be death, and summary death. So I'm impressed with that, and certainly Paul seems to follow along that line in Romans 13. The governmental authority carries the sword, not in vain. What do you use swords for? Spanking? Piercing. Maiming and killing is what you use swords for. Yes? What is the spirit of the bayonet?
To kill.
Yeah. So same thing here with the sword. So I find both in the Old Testament and the New, the implication of capital punishment as a requirement by God, and He will give further explanation of that later on in the law of Moses. Mind you, the Noahic covenant is made with whom? No? Yeah, all flesh. It's not only made with the human race, it's also made with the animals. Are you with me here? So that this is not a matter of jurisprudence. It's not a matter of the wisdom of a judge and the exercise of mercy. It is a matter of divine requirement of the human race. Are you with me here? So I read in 9:6, whoever sheds human blood by other humans must his blood be shed. For in God's image, God has made humankind. We have argued that the image of God is in part a sign of the sovereignty of God over the earth. Yes? To attack the sign of the image of God, to attack the sign of the sovereignty of God is an act of high treason. And high treason has almost universally been visited with capital punishment. How much more when the high treason is high treason against God? Do you follow this? So while capital punishment is a horrific penalty, horrific, brothers and sisters, it ought to be. Sin is horrific. The cross is a horrific thing. It's an obscenity. Yes? Mm-hmm. Because sin is an obscenity. The only way to deal with sin is by obscene means. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. All right. So capital punishment is an awful thing. One of the things that has made capital punishment in part unjust in our system is that we have hidden it off. In the 19th century, we made it a public celebration. It should not be a celebration. It should be the community gathering to join in the execution of a criminal so that the community all bears the responsibility of carrying out justice. And therefore, every one of us is required to make sure that this is a just act. Do you follow this? So we should neither rejoice nor hide from capital punishment. We should be all implicated in it in one sense or another. How exactly you do that, I don't know in our system, but at least this is the point. Later, when capital punishment is enjoined on Israel, all the community is to gather in stoning the criminal. You remember this? The witnesses are the first ones to lift their hands against the criminal, and subsequently all the rest of the community is to join in it. So there are some principles, I think, about capital punishment in the Scriptures that we haven't been sufficiently attuned to in thinking about what's going on in it. Just do notice, though, that in 9:1 you have the blessing, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth. And in 9:7 you reiterate that, so there is the inclusio that we mentioned yesterday. But as for you, be fruitful, multiply, increase abundantly on the earth, and multiply on it. Then I have the sign of the covenant. What is the sign? Rainbow. In Hebrew, the name for the rainbow is keshet, which is only significant in that the word keshet is also the word for the war bow, what you take to battle to shoot your arrows with. Yes? Why is that significant? The sign of the covenant is not arbitrarily chosen. The sign of the covenant is chosen in terms of the covenant, the nature of the covenant, and its purpose. The covenant here guarantees that God will not destroy the human race by a flood again. Yes? Mm-hmm. Lightning is elsewhere described as the arrows of the Lord. Yes? So if the war bow is in the clouds, it's on the shelf. I can see the war bow. Yes? Then I don't have to worry about it. It's when it's hidden that I have to worry about it. Yes? So now why does God give the sign of the covenant?
To remind himself.
Ah, good. I don't usually get that answer. I usually get the answer, well, it's there to remind us that God is merciful. No. That's not what the text says. Look at chapter 9, verse 13. I will place my rainbow in the clouds, and it will become a guarantee of the covenant between me and the earth. Whenever I bring the clouds over the earth and the rainbow appears in the clouds, then I will remember my covenant. Does God need reminding? God's so angry at the earth, he sends his thunderstorm to destroy it. Yes? And here comes the lightning in the clouds, and it's striking humans and killing us on the earth. And then the rainbow appears, and he thinks, "Oh, I had almost forgotten. I was on the verge of forgetting that I wasn't going to destroy the earth by a storm again. So now I got to stop because now I remember." What's the point of God remembering? It's not a cognitive act first. That is, there was not a lapse of memory that the rainbow now solves. Yes? Memory in Scripture is not either a cognitive act, it's an affective act. That is to say, when I remember, I act differently. Yes? When I forget, I may still have the ideas in my mind, but I don't act differently in light of what I know. So I may know a story, but it may not have any bearing on the way I live, and so I have forgotten the story. It's, again, not cognitive. Does that make any sense to you? So, for example, when Jesus says in the Lord's Supper, "Do this to remember me," the bread comes around, and I take it, and I eat it, and I think, "Oh, my goodness, I had nearly forgotten Jesus, but now I remember him, and I'm bitter." But between the bread and the cup, I forget Jesus again. Yes? But the cup comes around, and I drink it, and I think, "Oh, dear me, I had forgotten Jesus again, but now I don't forget him. I remember him because I have drunk the cup." That's not the point. The point of remembering is that you come away from the table different than you came to it. Not simply that you now, you see, of course, in the Lord's Supper. Yes? In the Lord's Supper. You do know the Lord's Supper. Yes?
Yes, sir.
I know it's early, but wake up. In the Lord's Supper, we are to come as clean vessels before the Lord. Amen? For we must judge ourselves, we read. Yes? And therefore I must confess all known sin, or I am unworthy. And if I am unworthy in eating the supper, then I may be sickly or even... So better confess all your sin. If you don't confess all your sin, don't take the supper. Amen?
Amen.
We've got a lot more to say about this before we're done. But, folks, the supper has to be for the unworthy. There are no others to take it. That's the first thing to say. Second thing to say is, when I take the cup, what am I drinking? The blood. Why do you apply the blood to anything in the Scriptures?
Life.
Yeah, it's the life.
Cover sin.
Say,
Cover sin.
to cover sin and cleansing. Cleansing. Something is defiled, you sprinkle blood on it, it's cleansed. That's counterintuitive to us, but you sprinkle blood on something that's defiled, it's cleansed. Then, folks, when we take the blood of the Lord, what are we saying? I need cleansing. I haven't been cleansed, I need cleansing. Do you follow this? And my confession doesn't get it. The blood of Christ gives it. So, when I drink the cup, I am saying, I am a defiled vessel. I need to be cleansed. Not, I am now a clean vessel, so I can take the cup. Does this make sense to you? Now, further, when you leave the table, and you leave the table with a guilty conscience, it's because you have forgotten Jesus. Because one of two things is true. Either your conscience is sovereign, or Jesus is sovereign. Either your conscience determines reality, or the blood of Jesus determines reality about your sin. And if your conscience determines reality about your sin, you have forgotten Jesus. If the blood of Jesus determines your sin, you rule your conscience by the truth of God. You're acting in faith. Do you follow this? So here, this idea of memory. God will remember as He brings the storm. The bow and the cloud will remind Him so that He acts differently. He stops the storm so it doesn't bring destruction to the human race. Am I making sense on this? Folks, this is so crucial. And when we get to Deuteronomy, the concept of memory is going to be a dominant concept. So you've got to get this in mind. To remember is not an act of the mind, it's an act of the whole person. So when I remember, I do things differently than I did when I didn't remember. Does this make sense to you? All right. So the sign of the covenant, we'll have some other signs of the covenant as we go. The Abrahamic covenant sign is circumcision. The Mosaic covenant sign, it's a little harder. Sabbath is the sign of the Mosaic covenant. It's an interesting reality. We'll deal with that later. Now, Genesis 9 also has the curse on Ham. So if you had ham for New Year's Day, then you're cursed. Ham, what's going on? Why is Ham cursed? In fact, Ham is not cursed. It's Canaan that's cursed. Our forebears in America used this passage to prove that people from Africa are under the curse of God. This has nothing to do with any of that. Canaanites are not Africans. They're not blacks. They're different. And it's they who are cursed, not Africans. It's irrelevant to that whole issue. But why Canaan? It's Ham who did the wrong thing. Why is Canaan cursed? Well, first of all, what is it that Ham did? Ham comes into the tent, sees his father's nakedness. Yes? People have said, well, he engaged in homosexual relations with his father. The text doesn't say that. And furthermore, and it could be an implication of the text. There could be a figure of speech here. To see could be a figure of speech, but probably is not. How do Japheth and Shem solve the problem of Noah's nakedness?
They cover him up.
Yeah, they walk backwards and cover him up. So probably here it's simply the act of seeing. Later in Leviticus, one of the crucial terms that we'll see is to uncover your father's nakedness. You remember this? In the Holiness Code, there are relationships that you don't enter into sexually because they will uncover your father's nakedness. And this is probably the point, simply that he saw his father naked. And so Japheth and Shem solved the problem by laying the cloak over their shoulders and backing in so they don't see their father. What's happened is this issue of breach of family loyalty. Ham is a man who will breach family loyalty. Of the three brothers, who is the oldest? That's a hard one. It's probably Japheth who is the oldest. Are you with me here? Some of our translations suggest that Shem is the oldest, and it is open to question, but I would try to make the case that Japheth is the oldest. I don't have time to do that here. But who is second born? If Japheth is the oldest, Shem is second born. Ham is the youngest. Yes? Mm-hmm. Among Ham's sons, who is the youngest? Canaan. So Ham sins, and Canaan, the youngest, sins, and the youngest is cursed. Now, there's the first connection here. Why though is Canaan cursed? Well, we could apply to the principle that some have applied to visiting the father, or the sins of the father on the sons to the third and fourth generation. Yes? That's possible. There is another possibility that Noah has observed in Canaan the same propensity that is in Ham, namely breach of family loyalty. Probably the reason this passage is included in Genesis is that the book is written for the generation that's going into Canaan. And in Canaan, they're going to face the Canaanites. And they are going to be given the responsibility of doing something to the Canaanites. What? Killing them all. Why? Deuteronomy 7. If I don't think carefully about Deuteronomy 7, I will miss the point. But turn to Deuteronomy 7. 7:1. When the Lord your God brings you to the land that you are going to occupy and forces out many nations before you, Hittites, Girgashites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, 7 nations more numerous and powerful than you, and he delivers them over to you and you attack them, you must utterly annihilate them. To get the specific sense in which that's to be understood, you would look at 2:34, Deuteronomy 2:34. We'll not do that now. Make no treaty with them and show them no mercy. You must not intermarry with them. Do not give your daughters to their sons or take their daughters for your sons, for they will turn your sons away from me to worship other gods. The reason I would assume here, for the prohibition of marriage and for the requirement of annihilating the Canaanites is idolatry. That would be the surface level sense of the term, yes? Yes. But Israelites are permitted to marry idolatrous Egyptians. Yes? And Israelites are permitted to marry idolatrous Syrians. Yes? Yes? Yes, they are. Jacob marries two wives from Syria. All right? So if simply idolatry were the issue, then you couldn't marry any non-Israelite, ever. Does that make sense? So evidently, and Babylonians and Assyrians are permissible for marriage, but not Canaanites. So I wonder then why? What's going on? I would argue that the issue is this issue of family loyalty. The Canaanites are marked by breach of family loyalty. They are not loyal people, and they will teach you disloyalty. After all, Deuteronomy 7. See, I have a doctorate from Dallas Seminary. I know great and wise things most people don't know. I have great understanding, insight that most of you benighted poor souls don't have. And so I now will share with you this great insight and understanding. Deuteronomy 7 immediately follows Deuteronomy 6. Amazing! What insight! Deuteronomy 6 has the commandment, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and strength. Don't intermarry with the Canaanites, or they will turn your hearts away from serving me. Other peoples are not marked by breach of family loyalty. So you may marry them and teach them to worship. You see my point? But the Canaanites can't be tolerated. They must be destroyed. Genesis 10, the genealogy on Noah's family. One of our favorite passages, probably memorized it. Yes? My Sunday school teacher when I was a boy said if you can't pronounce some of these names, just say buttermilk and you're all right. So I'd be saying buttermilk through most of the chapter, right? But here, what's the point? The passage is fairly important. Didn't say this when we were in Genesis 5. I need to say it now. In a highly structured passage, you look for deviations from the structure. In Genesis 5, there are two deviations from the structure. One is with Enoch, yes, and who walked with God and was not because God took him. The other is with Lamech, who stops the structure of this highly structured passage of the genealogy to give the hope of rest. I may add at this point, in Deuteronomy, rest is the great hope for Israel in the land. Do you follow this? So the Lamech statement is already setting up the hope of rest for the conquest generation, that they will look for rest in the land. So here in Genesis 10 now, I have the table of nations, and in this table of nations I get the genealogy of Noah's sons. There are some interesting ideas in it. Sometime it would be useful to you to try to chart out this genealogy to see where the emphasis lies. We begin to see some interesting things in Genesis 10. We've already seen it in 4 and 5, but we can refer to them now easily in Genesis 10. There are 3 sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, yes? We say that in that way, even though Ham is clearly and demonstrably the youngest son of Noah. We don't know, it is an open question whether Shem or Japheth is the oldest brother, but we always say Shem, Ham, and Japheth for some reason. But Japheth is dealt with first, and most briefly. Typically what we get in the book of Genesis is we have the line through whom the blessing is going to go. So in Genesis 4, I have Cain, Abel, and ultimately Seth, yes? Cain is dealt with before Seth is. And he's moved off the scene so that we can focus on the line through whom the blessing will come through Seth, yes? Then I have Noah and his 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Japheth is dealt with first, and briefly, because Japheth's descendants live so far away from anything that Israel will be dealing with that they have almost no dealings with Japheth throughout the entire history. Moses is setting this up under the inspiration of God. Moses is setting this up to show the nations that Israel is going to be most concerned with. So you have among the Hamites and the Sethites, the Shemites, you have the nations that Israel will be most concerned with. You get Babylon, Assyria mentioned. You get the mention of the Canaanite nations, and the emphasis is really on Ham's family and the Canaanites. So if you ever do take the time to lay out on paper the genealogy of Noah in Genesis 10, then you will see the emphasis on the Canaanites. There are two kinds of genealogy in the book of Genesis. Let's see what's here. One is called a horizontal genealogy, and that's what we have here in Genesis 10. It's the kind of thing that we are familiar with in a genealogy, a tree, right? A family tree. It's inverted, of course, because you have the root at the top and then the branches all falling from it. But this is a horizontal genealogy. A horizontal genealogy is intended to establish lines of relationship, who is nearly related and who is far related, who is distantly related. Are you with me here? The ones that you are near related to are the ones that you owe family loyalty to. So the Amalekites and the Moabites and the Ammonites, the Edomites, you owe, as an Israelite, you owe family loyalty to. We're going to see this when we get into Numbers and Deuteronomy. The reason that the Amalekites are cursed by God is that they didn't practice family loyalty with Israel. Same thing with Moab. A Moabite, Deuteronomy 23 or 25. A Moabite, a descendant of a Moabite, is barred from the congregation of the Lord to the 10th generation. Are you with me here? Why? Because the Moabites don't show family loyalty to Israel when they go through the area to enter the land of Canaan. Are you with me here? Israel owes them family loyalty too, so they are not to take their land. Deuteronomy 1 will say this. 1 and 2 will say this. They're not to take their land. They're not to attack them. And so Israel shows family loyalty to the Moabites, but the Moabites don't show family loyalty to Israel. And so the near relatives you owe family loyalty to. I've got to know, if I've got to go into Canaan and wipe out the people of Canaan, I've got to know who the Canaanites are. And so in Genesis 10, I have the definition of who the Canaanites are. They're clearly defined so Israel will know who they must destroy and who they owe family loyalty to. Does this make sense? Right? The other kind of genealogy is a vertical genealogy. It's the one like we had in Genesis 5. We'll have another one at the end of chapter 11, where you have A became the father of B, and B became the father of C, and C became the father of D, and so on. You don't give all the collateral lines, you just give the direct lineage from one to another. The function of a vertical genealogy is different. It's a good device for moving quickly between two time periods and for showing legitimate descent. Yes? So the line of Seth is given in Genesis 5 to get us from Seth to whom? Noah. And we've got to see that the line of blessing has come legitimately from Seth to Noah. And then in Genesis 9, when the blessing is pronounced on Noah and his sons, it's clear why it's pronounced on them. Yes? Then again, in Genesis 11, we're going to move from Noah to Abram, because we've got to see why Abraham receives the blessing. It's a legitimate descent from the line of blessing through Shem. Yes? So a vertical genealogy has two functions: to move us quickly from one time period to another and to show legitimate descent, secondly. Then. So two kinds of genealogy. Alan Ross wrote one of his dissertations on genealogies. I got to share that with you. We've already talked about the function of Genesis 10. There's one verse in Genesis 10 that I need to point out to you. Verse 32. Now these are the families of the sons of Noah according to their genealogies by their nations, and from these nations spread over the earth after the flood. Spread over the earth. What's the point here? They're filling the earth. They're experiencing the blessing of God unwillingly. Genesis 11. In Genesis 11, verse 1, the whole earth had a common language and a common vocabulary. When the people moved eastward, they found a plain in Shinar and settled there. Then they said to one another, "Come, let's make bricks and bake them thoroughly." They had brick instead of stone and tar instead of mortar. Then they said, "Come, let's build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we will be scattered over the earth." What's the point of the statement? Yeah, they're in open rebellion against the blessing of God. They're finding a better way to blessing, better way to self-actualization than God has. So Genesis 3 is being repeated in a different form. Yes, ma'am.
But it says in 10:20, and I think it's mentioned in other verses also, that these are the sons of Ham according to their families, according to their languages. So is there more than one language, or?
Yeah, it's both. Genesis 10 covers a period that precedes Babel and follows Babel. So Genesis 10 has a time period. So here's Genesis 10 time period that begins at X and ends at Y. I don't know the time frame here. And Genesis 11 is here in the middle. There's one event that's picked out of that whole time frame to explain why the languages have arisen and why there is disunity in the earth and why all this thing has come to pass. So here's another place, folks, where of necessity, how else are you going to move from I can't think. How else are you going to move from Noah all the way down to the time of the Canaanites without going out of chronological order? Then you have to come back and pick up something that's important within that time frame. You see, one of the things that you have to realize about any written document is that a written document is linear. and I can't give synchronicity except by telling synchronous events subsequent to one another. That's the only way you can do it. So I'm covering a space of time from the flood down to the time of the Israelites, as it were. Then I have to come back and explain how things got to be as they are in Israel's experience. So Genesis 11 explains that. The human race in Genesis 3 rejected the means of God's blessing. Yes? The human race in Genesis 11 rejects the means of God's blessing, but God still has the purpose of blessing. So what's he going to do? He's going to do what he did in Genesis 6, start over with a new family. Yeah. So Genesis 11, we have the Tower of Babel incident in which the languages are divided. When God makes a statement here, we might misunderstand it as well. So let's talk about it. Verse 6, the Lord said, "If as one people all sharing a common language they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan will be beyond them." So now the human race is omnipotent. Yes? No. What is... words like all, every, each, nothing, all of these kinds of words are always to be defined like all other words are by context. Right? When you were a teenager, now if you're not from the U.S., you may not have had this kind of possible experience, but in the U.S., dating and running around with friends as a teenager is a common experience. Yes?
Yes.
So when you were a teenager, you came home late one night. Yes? Mm-hmm. Later than you were supposed to. Mm-hmm. Yeah? And your parents said, "Where have you been?" And you said, "Well, all the kids were on Mockingbird and went to the movies."
That's right.
By that, you meant to say 185,000 teenagers were on Mockingbird Lane. Yes? 185,000 of them congregated all at once, picked you physically up off the ground. You couldn't get home. You couldn't get to the telephone. 185,000 forced you into the theater. You had to sit there and watch that movie because you were crushed by the crowd. You were unable to get away. Yes? All the kids were going. Yes? And in your serious loyalty to your family, you longed to get free, but you could not because of the crash. And so finally, when the movie was over, all the teenagers, 185,000 of them dispersed, finally setting you free so that you could rush home to the arms of your loving and loyal parents. That's exactly what you mean, wasn't it? No, what you meant was the other two you were with were going to the movies. Yes? All never means, well, I shouldn't say that. All does not by itself mean all without exception. It means all that I'm talking about. Well, what's he talking about when he says nothing will be impossible for them? What's he talking about in the context?
That even they'll think if they're capable of anything.
Yeah, specifically of any rebellion. All kinds of rebellion will be possible for them. So now God in wrath and in mercy makes it impossible for the human race to unite in rebellion, in rebellious action. Wenn ich spreche an Ihnen auf Deutsch, dann wahrscheinlich, I can't speak it very well anymore. There was a time when I could do it. Wahrscheinlich, Sie würden mich nicht verstehen. Richtig? Nein? Ja, a few of you, ein paar möchte, but stop here, I've got to quit. I've only spoken live German about 3 times in my life, and it was difficult. I had to plan it out before I got there. The point is that when I can't speak the same language that you do, then it really does make it difficult for me to unite with you in any kind of activity. So the Tower of Babel really aims to, we have the parallel with Genesis 3, they refuse the plan of God for blessing, the disunity of the race. God makes it impossible for the race to unite in rebellion against God. We all are rebellious, but we don't unite in rebellion, drawing upon the race the unified judgment of God. Then we have in Genesis 11 the genealogy of Shem, bringing us from Noah down to Terah and Abram. 11:26, look there. Terah had lived 70 years. He became the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran. How old was Abram when Terah died? How old was he when he went into Canaan after Terah died? 75. So Terah was dead when Abram was 75. That means that if Abram is the firstborn, then Terah had to die at age 145, yes?
Sure.
How old is Terah when he dies?
145?
No. Look at 1132. 205. What's that mean about Abram's birth order? He's not the firstborn. More likely, Nahor is the firstborn because he dies first among the brothers, and then leaving Lot. So Abram is probably not firstborn. Why am I belaboring this? It's a pattern. There's a pattern. God does not choose the son that anybody else would choose. Consistently through Genesis, the firstborn is passed over by God in favor of some other son. Cain is firstborn as far as we can tell. Abel is, by the way, not necessarily secondborn. He might be 15th born. We just simply have the statement that Adam and Eve have 2 sons. One's named Cain, one's named Abel. But we don't know the specifics of the order of Abel's birth. Do you follow this? He's just born after Cain. But Cain is obviously passed over. And we would say, well, for obvious reasons, Cain is an unworthy man. But then I come to Noah, and I think I can make the case that Japheth is a worthy man. And yet, Japheth is passed over, and Shem gets the blessing. I come then to Abram, and Abram is not the firstborn. He may, in fact, have been the thirdborn. Nahor and Haran are both passed over in favor of Abram. Abram has 2 sons that are of significance to us, Ishmael and Isaac, and we know that Ishmael is passed over in favor of Isaac, even contrary to Abram's own wish. Yes? Now we would say, yes, but Ishmael was born to Hagar, who was an Egyptian, right? But Isaac has two sons for whom I can't make the distinction of mother, Esau and Jacob. Esau is clearly firstborn, and yet Esau is passed over in favor of Jacob. And we would say, well, Esau, and I'm going to say that Esau is probably a dim bulb. He's he's not a sharp guy at all. And I don't think Isaac is either. I think Isaac and Esau are both equally dim. They're 5-watt bulbs in family where 60 watts were definitely needed. But Jacob was more like 100-watt, and Esau was a 5-watt. But is Esau passed over because Jacob is more worthy?
No.
No. I look at the family of Jacob, and there are 12 sons. The first, you have Reuben, Levi, Simeon, and Judah. Reuben, Levi, and Simeon are passed over in favor of Judah and Joseph. Yes? So I find this pattern consistently. And the point seems to be that God is consistently passing over the one whom man would choose. Of the 4 patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, Abraham chose the wrong son, Isaac chose the wrong son, and Joseph chose the wrong son. When he brought Manasseh and Ephraim before Jacob, Joseph wanted Manasseh to get the blessing, but it was Ephraim that got the blessing. You recall this. Only Jacob chose the right son among the four patriarchs. That's remarkable, because Jacob chose, and he chose twice. And in fact, we could say 3 times, because he chose Judah, he chose Joseph, and he chose Ephraim. So whatever bad we say about Jacob needs to be kept in that context. And we'll say a lot bad about Jacob. But Genesis 11, the genealogy of Shem, is aimed to get us from the time of the Tower of Babel, in fact, all the way back to the flood, to get us down to then the time of Abram, and to show us the descent of the line of blessing so that we will understand how Abraham can inherit that blessing.